Well, good morning. Happy Father's Day. It's good to be here with you. Last Tuesday, our 10-year-old daughter Ryan declared that she had a new favorite movie. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to see this live action version of Beauty and the Beast. It is a stunning movie, a classic story, an epic love story with stunning cinematography. Incredible movie, and I was a little bit nervous before she saw it because you never really know what you're going to get from Disney, do you? I mean, I'm still going through therapy from all of those movies that I watched when I was growing up. I mean, it seemed like the formula for Disney was always the same thing. The mom or the dad, or maybe both of them, had to die some devastatingly spectacular kind of death, and then there was always some hideous, ghoulish, evil relative that was somehow involved. It didn't matter whether it was Dumbo or Bambi or Snow White or Cinderella. It was tough, and it always seemed that the main character were kind of the same people, wasn't it? It was basically this blonde-haired, Barbie-waisted princess who was always trying to look for her blue-eyed Aryan Prince Charming to come and save her from herself, right? But I must hand it to Disney, because they've come quite a ways in the last number of years, haven't they? I saw this movie and others, and I'm starting to think that they're kind of going out a little bit. They're stepping out a little bit. No longer is all of the main characters, the protagonists, the same. We now are starting to see some ethnically ambiguous princesses, right? Of every kind of size and shape and shade of color. And they're not always pining away for their Prince Charming. Now, what we're going to see is we've been seeing movies in recent years like Frozen. You remember that one, where the love that redeems the kingdom, that saves the kingdom, isn't necessarily with a Prince Charming. In this case, it's the love between two sisters that does this, right? And I don't know how many of you have seen Moana, but it's this Polynesian princess's love for her family and her people, and particularly her grandmother, that redeems the story in the end. Even this new Beauty and the Beast that we have seen come out, they've gone way out on a ledge, Disney has. I don't know how many of you are aware of the controversy, this little scene in the final ball where we see two apparently gay men dancing together. All I have to say is this isn't your grandma's Disney anymore, okay? And so today we start this 4-week series on Ruth. It is the last sermon series in an annual theme, a year-long theme that we've had entitled Share the Love. Do you remember? We started off the fall with a sermon series, Why Not Share the Love, where we talked about sharing our faith and church and community. And then after our stewardship season, we had our Advent season where we talked about unwrapping pure love. And then in the winter, we had this glimpse into what love looks like in action through our Peacemaker series. And then we talked about what happens when that love seeps down into the core of our being and starts to change us in our Lenten series, which we entitled Transformed. And then finally, we've just finished last week wrapping up our spring sermon series on the length and the how high and long and deep and wide is the love of Jesus Christ. And so this will be our last sermon series in this series until we start our summer series on the 500-year anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And what's interesting is that this story of Ruth, which is very much a Disney-esque kind of epic love story, is heralded by many to be not just one of the most beautiful stories in the entire Bible, but one of the most beautiful stories in all of human literature. And even though it was written almost 3,000 years ago, it kind of resembles more one of the recent Disney movies than the ones in the 1950s, in that the love that we see here in this story, although it does have its own Prince Charming, we're not going to meet him until next week, but even the name, Boaz, is going to make girls swoon from continent to continent. It doesn't matter what the language or the culture or the century is. I mean, a name like Boaz, you gotta love it. But the real redeeming love in this story is not the Prince Charming, but the love that we see between this young, foreign, immigrant refugee girl and, of all things, her mother-in-law. I mean, even Disney wouldn't go that far out on the ledge, right? And why? Because we have this stereotype about mother-in-laws here in our society today, don't we? I was very impressed. In both my Monday and my Thursday small groups, we are reading through the book of Ruth as to coincide with this sermon series. And on Monday, I asked our small group if any of them had a good relationship, had a good relationship with mother-in-laws, and pretty much everyone in our small group actually did, which I was very impressed because it's not typically that way. In fact, I don't think I'll take a poll today in here, so you don't have to worry about that. Typically what I hear is something like this friend of mine, a police officer who, when he was asked, if you ever in your line of duty found yourself in a position where you had to arrest your mother-in-law, what would you do? And he said, I'd call for backup. I do know that often, this declaration of love that Ruth says to Naomi that Emma just read, this is one of the most beautiful passages of all time, and it's often read in wedding ceremonies. And when couples want to use this passage, and I tell them, now you know that this is a daughter and she's saying this to her mother-in-law, they always choose something else. But we have this story, and it begins with this couple. We have Naomi and Elimelech, and they're living in Bethlehem, in Judah, and life is good. They have 2 children, Mahlon and Kilian, and everything is fine. And then it all starts to unravel. And the first thing that happens, the very first sentence in the first verse of the first chapter of Ruth, it says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land of Judah. And we all experience our own famines, don't we? We lose our health, we lose our job, we lose a loved one, we just lose our way. And suddenly the places that had always fed us in the past seem to dry up, and we find ourselves hungry for the way things used to be. And so Naomi and Elimelech, they make a plan. And they move to Moab, which is just on the other side of the the Dead Sea. Not very far geographically, but worlds apart culturally. A different language, different culture. They worship different gods. It's a hostile area, a group of people that they were always fighting with. At this point in time, Israel had conquered Moab, so the Israelites were free to move there, but it would not have been an easy situation for them. And so they move there, and Naomi finds herself with 3 major tragedies in her life. The first is just having to leave her home and her people and her culture and her family to move into this new place. They go to try to look for food and opportunity for a brighter future. And it's interesting, isn't it, how as much as things change over time, everything ultimately just remains the same? That it's the very same thing. It's the very same fertile valleys, both literally and figuratively, that bring refugees and immigrants to our shores today. And so Naomi first loses her people and her culture and her land. And then not long after she arrives, she loses her husband. The children's father, Elimelech, dies. This may not be the best story for this day, would it be? Whose idea was this anyway, Catherine? On Father's Day. Elimelech passes away. We don't know why or how, but he does. Leaving Naomi alone as a stranger in this strange land to try to raise these 2 children. And as they grow up, as second-generation immigrants often do, for a host of different reasons, both of the boys become enamored with the local Moabite hotties. And they both end up marrying one named Orpah, not to be confused with Oprah, and the other one named Ruth. And it says that 10 years later, the final blow comes as both of Naomi's boys die as well. Again, we don't know how, we don't know why, but we know it happens, and it leaves not only Naomi a widow now, but her two daughter-in-laws widows now as well, in a time when there was no food stamps, there was no soup kitchens or social security, there was no kind of social safety net whatsoever. As we see over and over throughout the New Testament, the most vulnerable people in that ancient world were orphans and who? That's right. We see it throughout the Old Testament, even coming into the New Testament. In Exodus, it says, "Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless." In the book of Psalms, the Lord watches over the foreigner and sustains the fatherless and widow, but he frustrates the ways of the wicked. In Psalm 68, a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy dwelling place. Even in the New Testament, in the book of James, it says, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress." It wasn't like there wasn't anything there. There were certain traditions and customs in Israel that were there to try to help the widows. In fact, this whole idea of levirate marriage, when a man died, his widow, it was expected that one of his brothers would marry his widow and to take her into his family, to give her her own children so that she would have children to take care of her in her old age. Or if a woman was beyond the marrying years, it was expected that they would be able to move in with extended family, with their next of kin who would take care of them in their old age. But so many women back in this system ended up falling through the cracks, and that was certainly the case with all three of these women, because both of Naomi's boys had died, so there were no brothers to marry the others. And as far as Naomi was concerned, there was no relatives there in Moab that she could move in with. And so it became fairly clear pretty quickly that Naomi was going to need to go back to Bethlehem, need to go back to her family, back to her next of kin. And this is where it gets interesting, because according to the custom and according to the obligation, they all knew that Orpah and Ruth were sort of obligated to go along with Naomi. That they would go back to Bethlehem, that they would then be married off to whoever the closest next of kin would be, and then those families would take care of Naomi in her old age. And so all three of them are on the path, on the road, heading back to Bethlehem, when suddenly Naomi, out of the goodness of her heart, stops them. And she says, "I can't do this. You can't come with me." She knows that these girls are the only thing that stands between her and total destitution back in Bethlehem. But she says, "You know what? I knew how hard it was for me to go to a strange land and to be a foreigner and to not have any of my family around, and I do not want that for you. I love you all too much. You need to go back to your own homes and your own families. Go back to your parents. Find good Moabite boys to marry and have a real life. I will be fine." And then she ends it with this incredibly beautiful blessing. She says, "May the Lord deal with both of you kindly." And now, kindly may be the biggest malpractice of biblical translation known to the Bible. Because the Hebrew word that is translated as kindly, this is worse than us using just the term peace to try to translate the Hebrew word shalom. Because the Hebrew word here that's used here and translated as kindly over and over again is the Hebrew word hesed. And hesed is one of the most powerful and beautiful words in the Bible. It talks about God's fierce loyalty to us, God's unbelievable faithfulness, God's unconditional love that will follow us wherever we go and hold on to us as tenaciously as a bulldog. That God will always accept us and forgive us and continue to love us no matter where we go or what we do. It speaks to this kind of commitment and loyalty and faithfulness. In fact, to try to give you a little bit of insight, throughout the Old Testament, they used to love storks, and they had this idea about storks, that storks were the most incredibly loyal and faithful and fiercely caring to particularly to their young, that the stork mothers had this maternal instinct that they would go anywhere and do anything for their young. This is where the legend comes from, that storks are the ones that deliver babies. And when the Hebrews went to name the stork in Old Testament times, they named it a Hasidah, which came directly from this word hesed, this incredible kind of faithfulness and commitment. And so Orpah gets it, and she says, okay, I'm out of here, grabs her bags, and heads home. But it says here in chapter 1 that Ruth clung to Naomi. And now I think we need to be really clear here. In today's day and age, in our society today, being clingy isn't seen as such a good thing, right? But at this moment, in this particular situation, this is an incredible declaration of love and faithfulness and commitment. And Ruth takes it a step farther by saying one of the most beautiful declarations of love ever known in human literature. She says, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. And your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die." And then she's saying that not even death is going to separate them. "And there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." It is one of the most beautiful passages ever. It talks about this hesed kind of loyalty and commitment. And the reason that this is even in the Bible, I mean, you need to understand that when they were putting together the Old Testament canon, there was a lot of other books that were competing for what little room they had. It wasn't because this story was just about a mere human love. It was because everybody looked at this story and said, "Oh my gosh, that is it. That is exactly the kind of love that God has for each and every one of us." And the reason that it made it into the New Testament canon, when we were putting together the New Testament and we're relegating a lot of those Old Testament books to be part of the Apocrypha, the reason that Ruth made it in was particularly Christians looked at this declaration, at this story, and said, "My gosh, that is exactly what Jesus did for us." Jesus came out of the glory of heaven, came out of his home where he was comfortable and everything was glorious and grand, and he came down to be a stranger in a strange land. He came down to a foreign culture and a foreign language, to a hostile territory, to tell us that his loyalty and his faithfulness and his commitment to us is unwavering. To say that no matter what famines we go through in our lives, no matter what we deal with, the frustrations and the disappointments and the things that we lose, that God will always be there. And that we will never again, ever have to be alone. It was Jesus who basically came to give us that exact same speech. "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you," Jesus said. "Where you go, I will go with you. And where you stay, I will stay as well. your people, have become my people. And I want to be your God. Where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. This is basically exactly what Jesus says to each one of us. And so, really, the only question that's left is, what is going to be our response? In light of this God who has given us this hesed kind of love, of fierce loyalty and commitment and faithfulness to us, what does that inspire or demand or draw out of us in return? In these days, where we are so individualistic, where we are so commitment phobic, where we move so quickly away from our extended families and out of communities, and we swap spouses for another one and churches for another one, and we're moving so fast from place to place, what does Hesed look like in your life? What is your commitment and your loyalty and your faithfulness to your family and to your children and to your church and even to your God? What is that? And what does it look like for you? You know, the very last verse of this chapter says this. So Naomi returned from Moab accompanied by Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. This kind of declaration that Ruth made to Naomi, it demands some kind of response, doesn't it? I mean, can you imagine if Ruth had said to Naomi what she just said, and then Naomi said, "Oh, that is so sweet, but you go on and I'm going to go this way"? No. They spend the rest of their lives walking to Bethlehem side by side, their lives intertwined with each other, just unmistakably bound up in each other and tied to one another, their fates tied together, their lives tied together, everything tied together. Jesus Christ has made the same kind of declaration to each and every one of us. God's promise to be there through thick and thin, to come into a foreign land, into our lives, to walk with us, whatever we go through, whatever happens to us, whatever disappointments, however much we let God down, that God will be with us through thick and thin. And the only question that's left is, what is our response going to be? Amen.